And now, I'd like to introduce Calvin Welch. Calvin has an undergraduate degree in interdisciplinary social science and a graduate degree in political science. He teaches college courses and served on San Francisco task forces and committees. But what made us focus on trying to get Calvin to come and speak at our annual dinner is that he is a lifelong activist with years in the trenches of affordable housing policy in one of the least affordable cities in the US, and we thought we might be able to learn something. He's also part of the activism that he has been involved in, has been initiatives, which I think many of us can sympathize with. He's managed and campaigned for a district election campaign in 1976, in 1986 Proposition M growth limitation measure, 1994 Proposition A $350 million seismic safety bond, 1996 Proposition A $100 million affordable housing bond, 2000 Proposition L campaign to save San Francisco, 2002 Proposition B affordable housing set aside and Proposition N transfer tax increases. And in 2010, I guess they did it the second time to increase the transfer tax again. And Calvin's been challenging the conventional wisdom that more density necessarily creates more affordability, which is a topic of great interest in Boulder. So would you all welcome Calvin Welch.
First, let me thank you all for inviting me here. The work that I think we do, I feel a certain kinship, is kind of isolating work. It is work that is not generally acclaimed by the media, mass and particular. It is work that creates a lot of criticism, and you start feeling sorry for yourself and believe that only you are engaged in the good fight and that no one else is. And here I come 900 miles to the east, to the west of Boulder, and find all you kindred spirits. I specifically want to thank Alan Bowles and Leonard May, who have offered me guidance and good humor, and I greatly appreciate their generosity of information and spirit. I want to talk about lessons learned from the war on the ground in San Francisco. And the first lesson is that we make honest mistakes. We need to talk about those mistakes openly and share what was done to correct those mistakes with others. So that's what I'm going to do, hopefully tonight. Next slide, please. I don't think I need to tell you folks in Boulder that there is a housing crisis, affordability crisis in Boulder and San Francisco, but perhaps you don't understand, next slide please, how wide it is. In every major American city that has a functioning economy, that has an economy that is healthy, there is an affordable housing crisis. It's not because of the particular, of any particular city. We're going to talk about tonight why that might be the case. Next slide, please. My favorite headline is this one, which was from a website to cover San Francisco real estate prices from last month. San Francisco rents may never go down, says new report. You might want to sit down for this one. But it was, next slide please, superseded last week by this one, which is French Cashflow's cheaper to rent than San Francisco apartments, which is sad but true. So next slide please. I'm not sure you can read all the fine print, but very basically San Francisco is 47 square miles. It has the second highest density of any city in the United States. And of that 47 square miles, only about 12.9 square miles are are zoned for residential development. So at the very initial aspect of understanding San Francisco, one should understand with 850,000 people in basically 12.9 square miles to live in, it's a pretty dense city already. It is, next slide please, also a fallacy that somehow the West Coast is some pristine, orchid-eating hideaway of suburban life. This is from the 2010 census. The dark spots that you see are cities and metropolitan areas of high density. Look at the West Coast, the California coast. Look at the supposed center of the population density, the East Coast. California has very dense development in many parts of the state, yet we still have a great affordable housing crisis. Let me give you two reasons for why we perhaps all suffer from the same thing. Next slide, please. Adjusted in 2015 dollars, Jimmy Carter's 1978 HUD budget was $249 billion. Barack Obama's HUD budget, 2 years out from the end of his term, was $46 billion. That is to say, Barack Obama's HUD budget was 19% of Jimmy Carter's budget. The federal government has gotten out of the business of affordable housing. Between 2006 and 15, 55% decline in home funding. That's H-O-M-E, capital H-O-M-E. That is the principal federal program for developing affordable apartment development. 55% decline. From 07 to 13, 159,000 renters nationwide were dropped from HUD's renter assistance program. Between 2000 and 2014, the population of the United States living in neighborhoods with federal poverty rates of at least 40% more than doubled. Obama is asking this year for $48.9 billion for a HUD budget, down from last year's budget. So if the federal budget is up, where's the money going? Next slide, please. Perhaps you've never heard of, perhaps you have heard of a policy called quantitative easing. This is the policy of the Federal Reserve, which directly invests public money in the financial sector. And it has been doing so since the housing-induced speculative bubble crash in 2008. Next slide, please. Currently, the federal government has spent since 2008 $4.4 trillion in providing financial assistance to financial institutions. Currently, in quantitative easing phase 3, which began in September 2012, the federal government, through the Federal Reserve System, is supplying the financial sector $85 billion a month. Let me say that again. $85 billion a month to the financial sector. Barack Obama is asking for $48 billion a year for HUD programs. $85 billion a month, $48 billion a year. Where does that money go? That money goes basically to the financial sector. And for those of us who have had to deal with the incredible explosion of the technology sector, you come to realize that the tech sector is basically being fueled by investments that is coming from the financial sector. In short, it's basically quantitative easing dollars that is driving the incredible profitability of the tech sector, and it is the tech sector in San Jose, in Boston, in San Francisco that is driving housing costs. It is not the lack of production. Next slide, please. In San Francisco, between 1960 and 2010, according to census figures, we produced, in that 50-year period, 50% more homes than we had new residents. So what you hear about San Francisco stopping development, I don't know what people are talking about. Population increase between 1960 and 2010 by 64,000 people. We built 91,000 new housing units. That's 1.4 new housing units for every new resident for 40 years. Since 2010 is when we have had the crisis. Next slide, please. We don't have a crisis in the production in San Francisco of market rate housing. The red line is the actual production of market rate housing. The blue line is the line that the Association of Bay Area Governments estimate is the need for market rate housing in San Francisco. The red line is what we produced. The blue line is what we needed. Next slide, please. The exact reverse is opposite. The exact opposite is the case for affordable housing. The red line is what we produced. The blue line is what the Association of Bay Area Governments said our affordable housing need was in each year. So we do have a housing crisis in San Francisco, but it is not a crisis of housing, it is a crisis of affordable housing. Next slide, please. Between 2011 and 2013, 113,000 low or very low income people moved out of San Francisco, according to our county controller's office. And the controller concluded that adjusting for other demographic factors, income appears to be the significant contributor to whether an individual has moved out of San Francisco this decade. So we introduced, next slide please, a third issue, which is the relationship between housing costs and income. This is, according to HUD, from 1996 to 2015, the average family, household of four, median income in San Francisco, compared with the median price for a single family home in San Francisco. Between 1996 and 2015, median income for a household, a family household in San Francisco increased by 60%. The cost of a single family home increased by 390%. Inflation have in fact benefited from the economic development that has occurred in this nation since the late 70s. Adjusted for inflation, median income for most Americans has stayed stagnant, and for poorer Americans has actually dropped, while there have been dramatic increases in income for the top 1%. Nowhere is this more clear than San Francisco, and I think the fact of the matter that we have been producing more market rate housing than affordable housing, that income has not kept pace with housing costs, and that we are losing low-income San Franciscans because, in large measure, of their income. It is not surprising then that we do not see a drop in housing costs if there is an increase in market rate housing production. The market rate housing market is dominated by that portion of the population that is increasing its income, which is not the overwhelming majority of San Franciscans, or for that matter, Americans, and I'm sure the same is true in Boulder. Next slide, please. In 2013, the city published for the first time, the Office of the Comptroller, this interesting graph. Blue lines are the amount of permits, housing permits, issued by the city per quarter. The red line is the Zillow website, real estate website, tracking of condominium costs, the average, the median sales price for a condominium. Do you notice a relationship between the two? It is remarkable. As building permits go up, median condo prices go up. And what's even more remarkable, when building permits drop, prices drop. This was so striking, I wrote a paper. We did a conference about it. We actually got some coverage. And the pushback, next slide please, was amazing. San Francisco exodus, why is there an exodus? Because we're not building 5,000 units a year. Who came up with 5,000 units a year? A spokesperson for a market-based housing, basically the real estate industry in San Francisco. What's the matter with San Francisco's? Shouted the Atlantic City Lab website. Progressive San Franciscans had a fatal Shakespearean flaw that would prove to be its undoing. And what was that? That we pushed for affordable housing over simply the construction of more housing. But perhaps the most elaborate, and I urge you, if you have 2 weeks to read it, How Burrowing Owls Lead to Vomiting Anarchists, or SF's Housing Crisis Explained, that appeared on TechCrunch. And the exact arguments that were talked about in terms of the increased pointedness of the debate in Boulder is made in this argument. This was basically an argument that said, baby boomers in California, and especially in San Francisco, gobbled up all the cheap housing and are keeping it from young people. And that the only hope is unleashing the market. And then finally, the Atlantic in December of last year, San Francisco's self-defeating housing activists again blames affordable housing advocates for the problem. Next slide, please. This is the city's figures for the actual production of housing in San Francisco by affordability level between 07 and 16. Now understand, the language is, the argument is that we have such a moribund planning process that is so dominated by NIMBYs and crazy baby boomers seeking to increase the value of their homes by denying anybody else any new housing, that there is absolutely insufficient supply of housing. These are figures from the Department of City Planning in San Francisco. Between 07 and 16, 43,261 units were either built or entitled, approved by the Planning Commission. Of that, 77% were market rate. Only 4% were for what we might call middle income people, people earning between 80 and 120% of AMI. And because of the untiring efforts of faith and community-based nonprofit organizations, which maybe somebody will ask me a question about and I can get into a little bit more detail, 19% of the housing that was produced, some 8,234 units, were permanently affordable to households earning 80% of median or below. And about 50% of that is affordable, 50%, about 4,000 of those units are affordable to people at 50% of median and below. Next slide, please. This is taken from day before yesterday from the Department of City Planning's map. This lists the major projects that are occurring, major residential development projects and plan areas that are occurring in San Francisco. As you can see, it's in the southeastern and eastern half of the city, where most of the development, the new market rate development, is occurring. Keep that general location in mind. Next slide, please. This is a real estate, Zumper real estate company, which, a real estate website, which actually tracks the rent price of newly constructed rental units in San Francisco, and by neighborhood. And what you can see is in the dark red area, the area that corresponds with all the push pins, where all the market rate development is occurring, has the highest rents in the city. The pink areas are those areas that have the lowest rents in the city, and they are the areas that have virtually no new development occurring. The notion that we produce affordable housing by building high-density new development simply is not borne out by the realities. In the neighborhoods that have had the most market rate, the highest density and most market rate housing built has the highest rents in San Francisco. And your eyes are not deceiving you. That's $3,850 for a one-bedroom apartment in the South of Market in San Francisco. The area that has seen the most development, 70% of all housing development in San Francisco in the last 8 years have occurred south of Market. Next slide, please. So that you get it straight, this is not just rental, this is ownership housing in San Francisco. The median cost of a single family home in San Francisco is almost $1.2 million. The three bars are, excuse me, if we could go back. The three bars are, the tallest bar is for a single family home. The light green bar, the dark green bar is for a condo. And the third bar is for a San Francisco invention called a TIC. And a TIC is a tenant in commons purchase of a building, in which a rental apartment building is emptied of its tenants and then sold apartment by apartment to a newcomer. And generally after an eviction has occurred and a declaration required by state law that the landlord no longer wants to do rental housing anymore. And so they sell it as a TIC. A TIC is not a condo. We regulate condominium conversions in San Francisco. We only allow 200 a year because of the impact that it has on housing, especially rent-controlled housing. We can't, because of state law, regulate tenants in common. And that is one of the great contradictions that we have to deal with. What has the city's response been to this affordable housing crisis? Next slide, please. A density bonus program for market rate housing development. What you see in the blue areas that include many low-income neighborhoods, the parcels, some 30,000, that were going to be given a 2-floor density bonus if the developer agreed to meet our inclusionary housing requirement, which is 12%, up to 100% median income, and add another 18% for a total of 30% of housing able to be afforded by people earning between 120 and 140% of median. In short, we were giving a density bonus for market rate housing developers to build market rate housing. When you then take a look, next slide please, at what the actual median income is by neighborhood in San Francisco, you see a huge variation. You see the African American portion of the city in the southeast quadrant of the city at $49,000 a year. I want to point out that 140% of median in San Francisco is a household income of $180,000. So we were proposing a density bonus in neighborhoods that had $24,000 a year median incomes, $48,000 a year median incomes, $49,000 a year median incomes. We were proposing a density bonus, the city was proposing a density bonus to build housing able to be afforded by people earning $140,000. That was a prescription for displacement, and there was great hue and cry in the communities that were affected, and we defeated it. We allowed a density bonus in much of the same areas that the city proposed, but only if the development was 100% affordable. And only if the development did not demolish existing rent-controlled or affordable housing. Next slide, please. This is a map of the census tracts in San Francisco done by a project of the University of California Sociology Department, which maps gentrification in the Bay Area. The dark blue are those areas that are experiencing what is called extreme gentrification. That is in which first-generation gentrifiers are being gentrified out. In short, what we like to call millionaires being displaced by billionaires, which is a phenomenon, believe it or not, in San Francisco. If you remember where all those tax were, where all the market rate development had, you will see a remarkable similarity in geographical location. That where market rate housing development, high density market rate housing development is underway is where the greatest gentrification, the greatest displacement of moderate and low income San Franciscans are. Next slide, please. Having defeated the city's density bonus program, in May, we were confronted with Governor Brown, who decided to require as a right, without any public hearing at the local level, a density bonus of up to 2 floors for any developer that would produce 5% of the units being affordable. Let me say that again. A state-mandated density bonus that could not be overturned by a local planning commission that allowed 95% market rate development. That was Governor Brown's solution to the affordable housing crisis: greater density and cut the red tape at the local level. It lasted for 2 months. In May, he withdrew the proposal. It's not all over, however. We expect to meet it again. What are these people thinking, you may ask? Next slide, please. Go to The Economist, April 4th of April, 2015. And you will see a series in The Economist magazine, The Voice of Neoliberalism, of the theory of neoliberalism, in which the major tenet is government's primary role is to facilitate the smooth running of the private market. Remove regulations, remove all impediments of the smooth running of the market, and we'll all be so much better off. So look at the first proposal of The Economist. Government should ensure that city planning decisions are made from the top down. When decisions are taken at local level, land use rules tend to be stricter. Oh, really? But look at the second one and get ready to deal with this one. Tax land, not the improvements on the land. Tax underused land higher than heavily used land. Force landowners to develop by taxing unused land at a higher rate than utilized land. That's what we have to look forward to, folks. And it's something I think that is a big part of Donald Trump's art of the deal. So keep that in mind. Last, next slide, please. So what's the first lesson that we learned in San Francisco? You have to control the market. The market is not our friend. The market does marvelous things for beans and rutabagas and jeans and maybe cars. The market doesn't work real well in healthcare, and the market doesn't work real well in housing. So by 2011, San Francisco had price controls on 64% of its units. And that's the only thing that is keeping what remains of the middle class, the working class, and people of moderate income left in San Francisco. 172,000 units are controlled rents. 30,000 units have been built by faith and community-based nonprofits, which cannot raise rents above that which is greater than 30% of the total income for the households in those housing units. We have 6,259 public housing units that are hanging on by their fingers. So we have a total of 372,000 units, 237,000 of which 62% have one form or another of price controls. Next slide, please. This November, there are 6 measures in the Bay Area establishing rent control or strengthening existing rent control. There are 7 measures, again at the local level, that will produce, if passed, $1.8 billion in general obligation bonds for the development of permanently affordable housing. And through the passage of various transfer taxes, we're at it again. We're raising a transfer tax, this time on properties of $5 million or more, transferred in San Francisco, which, wait for it, constitutes 20% of all the transactions in San Francisco are of $5 million or more. That tax alone will generate $48 million a year. It's on the ballot. There are 3 other measures that raise taxes or sales taxes, transfer taxes, or fees that will generate in 4 Bay Area counties $134 million annually for at least 20 years for the purpose of either eliminating homelessness, specifically in San Francisco, homelessness for families with dependent children, or affordable housing in general. So the reaction at the local level has been shape up, ship out, bite the bullet, pass taxes, do affordable housing that neither the state nor the federal government are doing, and not buying the notion that you do so by loosening local restrictions on market forces. Next slide, please. There are four basic lessons that I think we've all learned, at least in San Francisco. Coalition building is critical. All politics are local. You don't get what you don't ask for, so ask. And make a friend before you need a friend. Second, housing is only an aspect of the general social and economic system in which it is located. There is no solitary housing solution to our housing crisis. We have to look at income, employment, education, and yes, land use planning and transit planning. That you cannot, as is so often the case, believe in some magic bullet housing. Greater density will solve the problem. No, it is part of a complex social whole that has to be addressed as part of that social whole. Third, resolving and dealing with this fundamental contradiction. The market must be regulated and contained at the local level, which requires allies from outside the local level. We must think and act both globally and locally. It's not good enough to think globally and act locally. We have to think and act globally and locally simultaneously. And that's a contradiction, and it's way hard to do. But that's the challenge that we face. Finally, in the face of increasing irrationality of the market, let me show you how irrational it is in San Francisco to develop the eastern part of the city. That is the city that we now know, part of the city that we now know will be 4 feet underwater in 40 years. We know that. The Warriors are going to spend $1 billion to build a stadium 20 feet from the shoreline. They're going to have to play water polo, not basketball, in 25 years. Stay calm and carry on in the face of increasing irrationality. Last slide. This was on my corner. I live in the Haight-Ashbury. This is at Ashbury and Page, and eviction had just happened. And the sentiment is all too real. And that's our challenge. I live in a city that has the functional equivalent, as we were talking about today, of post-traumatic stress syndrome. That's what massive evictions and constant pressure over unaffordable housing does to people. It's not a small thing that we're engaged in. It's an important thing that we're engaged in. And affecting the man-made environment is as critical as affecting the natural environment. And protecting the man-made environment is as critical as protecting the natural environment. Thanks.